really excited to be here today. Our mission is to make sure that you leave understanding what we like to call the other electric drivetrain fuel and understand where we are in the space. Thank you for understanding. So I have this extraordinary panel here with me. We're going to get right into it. The first question is, does the fact that major players have been working in hydrogen for generations make a difference to the evolution of this technology and to the evolution of the market? Go ahead, Terry.
Is this working? Okay.
I'll take care of that. I'll fix it.
Okay. Thank you, and thanks for being here. So yes, I mean, I started a nonprofit to work on hydrogen in the transportation sector, Energy Independence Now, 22 years ago. And there were very few of us, and certainly very few OEMs or other large companies working on, especially light duty, but even heavy duty transportation at that point. And now all of a sudden, thanks to the Hydrogen Hub and a number of other things that have occurred, it's suddenly this overnight success after 22 years. But having major companies involved is that sort of badge of honor that its time has come, that investments are being made, that many companies, as I'm sure you're going to hear today, are making investments that they're not sure will pay off or when. So there's a certain amount of, if we build it, they will come, that we didn't have 20 years ago, or when I was EPA secretary and started the hydrogen highway program in California to try to get supply and demand balanced and get more uses of hydrogen, particularly in the transportation sector, into California, we didn't have that benefit.
Yeah, it's a great question, Elise, and thank you for organizing today. The hydrogen kind of started in earnest in the 1960s with the NASA programs, and we know that hydrogen was a fuel type there. And then we've had at least one or two important cycles in hydrogen mobility, which is what's near and dear to my heart. We had the Shell station in Washington, D.C. under the George Bush 43 administration, and then now, of course, we have a network of hydrogen light duty and hydrogen heavy duty mobility stations in California and in Europe and Asia as well. So I think that when you consider the industry at large, when you consider our company's involvement in R&D since the 60s and then in mobility since the 2000s, and then now moving to import-export, integrated projects, and industrial projects, you see this kind of growth over time, and I think it's a really important note that we consider how all of these different sectors within hydrogen are working together to propel this sort of economy forward and building on the decades of experience.
Awesome, thank you. What about you?
Well, thank you very much for having me. Yeah. What I can say is things are moving really, really fast now in Europe. When I remember like 5 years ago, when I was talking to major OEMs, like even battery electric vehicles were not so much high on their top priorities. Then COVID happened, then the Americans with Tesla and the Chinese were going so fast, and European car manufacturers decided to go very, very strong on battery electric vehicles. And at the time they were saying battery electric vehicles would be for urban, short distance, and hydrogen will only be for heavy mobility. But then in Europe, the Russian-Ukrainian crisis happened, and then they suddenly realized that dependency to others for oil and gas, for the automotive industry was not so great. So the major OEMs recently switched their minds, and you had some very interesting announcement from Volkswagen, for example, that was really reluctant for hydrogen for passenger vehicle, that is saying now they are currently developing a 2,000 kilometers fuel cell vehicle, passenger vehicle. So things are moving really, really rapidly. So now Hopium has taken the bet to actually develop a mid-luxury car for passenger vehicle, but things are moving really, really fast, and we can see strong signal in the industry. For example, a fund was raised of 2 billion was raised in France to cover the backbone network for France, Germany, and the rest of Europe, and we can see that virtuous cycle, so to say, to set up. So that's clearly a good sign, and I think this megatrend is now coming to boom.
I'm so interested by both the industrial, the marine, and the passenger vehicle part of hydrogen's solution. And I think You know, as an outsider looking in, I thought that originally hydrogen would flourish in long haul. That was my sense of it. And I think you three have disproved, right, the early estimations of where hydrogen would find its highest and best value. So would you talk a little bit about how you decided on hydrogen in each of your spaces? And Tom, if you'd cover industrial, I think that would be really helpful. And then where you see yourselves going with hydrogen over the next couple of years, I think with a real if you could, with a real example of what it will look like to folks who are acquiring these vehicles or using these services, so that they get a chance to understand where hydrogen will be in their lives.
Well, I can kick us off because I heard my name and industry mentioned. So when you talk about using hydrogen to decarbonize industry or to decarbonize hard-to-abate sectors, we might be talking about things like manufacturing fertilizer, manufacturing concrete, asphalt, steel, and indeed refining petroleum. So all of these are processes that currently use hydrogen at an industrial scale. And the hydrogen that's being used is gray hydrogen or carbon-intense hydrogen that is resulted from cracking natural gas through a process called steam methane reforming. And we want to move to these cleaner, lower carbon intensity hydrogen pathways, for instance, electrolysis, sometimes called green hydrogen or pyrolysis. So the thesis is, let's start where we're already using hydrogen in industry, but then work to decarbonize or move those hydrogen pathways to lower, zero, and eventually negative carbon. And then once we've got that sort of demand surface established, that supply surface established, we can add other demands to that. So for instance, there's a very big project in Europe that Shell is running called Holland Hydrogen 1, and that is using offshore electrons from wind power to get zero carbon hydrogen molecules that are then being fed into an adjacent refinery. And so by starting with that sort of surface, we can then add other uses like heavy mobility, long haul, I heard you say, and then also just any other intense duty cycle. Maybe you add light duty as well. And what you see there is a sort of kind of economy of scale that results from using all of these sub-sector couplings at the same time and at the same source.
Would you just speak a little bit about, and then we'll let Terry weigh in, but why not battery electric for heavy in your estimation?
Well, at our company, we have solutions for all types of fueling sources, and one of the buzzwords that I'm using now is called polyfuel. And I will not speak ill or poorly of battery because we are near Shell Recharge Solutions headquarters in Los Angeles, and we like battery electrics and we like hydrogen fuel cell electrics. That said, one of the good things about hydrogen fuel cells are that we have these three benefits for heavy duty mobility: long range, high payload capacity, and quick fill times. So long range, let's just use a typical Class 8 truck as an example. We're looking at doing 300 to 500 miles with a charge time of about 12 to 15 minutes and full payload capacity at 82,000 pounds. And these are tricky things to do with other types of powertrains, and I think that hydrogen is really well suited for this use case.
Agreed, and it's a perfect segue to talking about Hopium's vehicle. Would you start with range and then?
Yeah, sure. So what we're currently doing, we are designing and manufacturing a car that is doing 600 miles that you can recharge in 2 to 4 minutes. It's about 500 horsepower, so you get 0 to 60 in less than 5 seconds. And yeah, that's the mid-luxury. You can compare that to, I don't know, a Porsche Taycan, for example, and or the Model S for Tesla. And so we're developing the car. We actually pre-sold 12,000 cars. Pretty happy about that. But at the same time, we are developing the tech itself. And of course, the tech can be used by a car, by a truck, by a ship, by pretty much anything that needs a powerful propulsion system. So we're working on that. But of course, one of the key aspects of it is to develop the infrastructure. One of the first questions that we have from investors is, where are the network, where are the charging points? So we're getting a reply to that. And of course, the key, or the other question and key question is, how do you produce hydrogen? And in Europe, so we do have this plan to get more renewables, but in France especially, we do have some nuclear power. So we're trying also to reboost the nuclear production facilities and capacity by mixing these two policies on hydrogen and nuclear plus renewables. So yeah, that's all happening at the same time. So that's kind of an exciting time to live at the moment.
Agreed.
I would just add that, first of all, if our goal is to decarbonize transportation and to avoid even worse consequences of climate change, then we have to use all of these different technologies. And I hate it when people who are in this space circle the wagons and point the guns inward and start shooting. So when Elon Musk says, oh, it's fuel cells, and oh, nobody wants that, and I've talked to him and I said, don't you realize that at some point you're going to want to penetrate the market of people who don't live in a single family home where they can plug in at night, or go to an office where they can plug in during the day. And by the way, right at one of the hydrogen fueling stations where I fuel my Toyota Mirai, they have about 40 high-speed Tesla charging stations. And I was refueling one day and I walked over and I said to the lady who was sitting in her car, how long does it take you to recharge your Tesla and Model S? And she said, well, if it's really empty, it takes about 45 minutes to an hour. She said, how long does it take for you to refuel your hydrogen car? And I said, in the time it took me to walk over here, it's now full. I'm going to walk back and leave. I mean, literally 5 minutes, and I get the same 300-mile range. But the point being that, you know, again, half the people in California do not live in a single-family home where they can plug in at night. So whether or not one is more efficient, you know, in terms of the energy use or whatever, if you want to decarbonize, we're going to need this. And then when it comes to heavy duty, you know, again, you can move cargo or batteries, but not both. And so you can lose as much as 25% of your cargo carrying capacity in a Class 8 truck if you're carrying batteries, and it takes a long time to charge. So one of the things we're seeing in the maritime industry is not just tugboats and ultimately ships, which may, you know, use ammonia or other forms of started out as hydrogen and are turned into a liquid. But the really big opportunity is in the ports themselves for the container handlers, the cargo handlers. In Los Angeles, Port of LA alone, there's about 5,000 vehicles that never leave the port, that can't drive to a fueling station of any kind. The diesel fuel comes to them, and then they're in constant use. So even the unions don't want to see those be battery operated, because it means the driver just plugs in somewhere and the union person who's been refueling is out of a job. But setting that aside, you'd have to take that piece of equipment offline for a very long period of time to recharge it, and the duty cycle times are just not enough to meet the need. And the ports have to decarbonize, have to clean all those trucks and cargo handlers up by 2030. So we've run out of time to keep experimenting with things that frankly just don't work, and we've got to move toward hydrogen electric for those heavy duty applications.
Yeah, so I think there's really good consensus on, for long haul, for heavy work, and for range, hydrogen offers an opportunity that may be differentiated. And I think even Mr. Musk would agree, you know, in a polite conversation, that makes sense. What for me is remarkable about this panel is we really have Europe and the US represented in a unique way up here. So could you talk for a minute about which nations are leading with hydrogen and why, and what the effects of that are? And Tom, can I bug you again to start?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a popular question, you know, who's leading and what nations are leading. And since the passage of the IRA, or Inflation Reduction Act, that is, you know, really a climate act in disguise. There's about $374 billion for all kinds of climate initiatives. And then, you know, a good chunk of that is going to hydrogen. 1 year before that, we had the IIJ, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and that has got the $8.5 to $9 billion hydrogen hub program that we can talk about, and that's certainly a very hot topic, really this month. So recently, the United States, I think, has gotten to have a leadership position in support for hydrogen. That maybe wasn't the case in 1 or 2 years before that, and evidence for that would be the Canadians and the Europeans are kind of following suit. But let's not forget what's happening in Asia. The most fuel cell trucks on the road in any country right now are in China. The biggest refueling station by capacity is in China. And the Chinese are running a lot of fuel cell electric buses. And we need to sort of acknowledge our own, call it cultural language biases. Or I will speak for myself. I'll acknowledge my own biases. I think mostly about what's happening in the West. There's a lot happening there. We've heard about Terry's Toyota Mirai and Toyota. Hyundai are probably the two leaders of the established OEMs, and then we've got the newly to be established mega competitor in Hopium to Hyundai and Toyota represented on the stage too. So when we look at what's happening in Asia, we look at what's happening with IRA, IIJA, and then we look at what's happening in Europe. That is where the biggest electrolysis production sites are. That's where the biggest Western fleets of trucks are running. I think that you will see these sort of three clusters in the world, call it Northwest Europe, US, Canada, and then Eastern Asia as the leaders. And I might suggest, well, how can we really get to the global south and bring hydrogen to all of these other regions and players? And that will hopefully play into hydrogen's use case, because we don't need to start from scratch electrifying global south nations that don't have electrical grids, and we can move molecules around relatively easier to do that. But yeah, I'm really proud as a American passport holder to say that IIJ and IRA are probably the most talked about pieces of legislation right now.
Yeah, I absolutely agree there. What do you think, Terry? And then we'll end. You want to finish with Europe? That sounds great.
No, I absolutely agree with what Tom just said. Maybe I can talk a bit about what's happening in Europe at the moment. So actually the Germans, they started early on the network. For example, in 2015, Daimler and others have decided to build a network, and they now have something like 150 charging points. They said they can accommodate about 6 million users, which is a big number. And they do have that network. In France, we have about 50 charging points, but it's evolving rapidly. So I guess the entire of Europe will be ready for that. It's being financed. The European Commission just set up a hydrogen bank, so there's 3 billion that can be leveraged to actually develop the network. So I think it will go strong, and there is now a consensus, to be honest, that was not existing 2 years ago. And to that extent, COVID, the COPs just helped, because the consensus says we need electrification, and it's going to be battery electric and the other electric car. And so now it's well into everyone's mind, so we can move forward. But it's absolutely true that we were quite amazed of the level of subsidized by the federal state here in the US. And I was saying to the president a few months ago that the worst case scenario for Europe would be that we actually import, after importing LNG from the US, that Europe starts to import not so low carbon hydrogen from the US. So it's also a strong case for sovereignty in Europe, where we showed that dependency to Russia, for example, was a kind of fragility for us.
I'd mention a few things. When you say which country is leading in hydrogen, it kind of depends which part of the value chain. Is it production, distribution, or end uses? And you've heard a lot about the end uses, but I advise the UN Green Climate Fund that's investing in developing nations. And we're seeing projects for green hydrogen production in Colombia, in Peru, in parts of Asia that, of course, do want to produce the green hydrogen and then ship it to the rest of us for use. In Mali and West Africa, they've found a proven reserve of hydrogen in its natural form, which is something that's very rare on Earth. We thought it didn't exist until recently. We thought you'd have to get all your hydrogen out of water or carbon or other materials. And so they may very well be an exporter of hydrogen. And then a really interesting case in Poland. About 5 years ago, an industrialist there who actually built his fortune in coal and oil and then wanted to transition away from that over time as he learned about climate change and environmental issues, got into the wind and solar business, wanted to get into hydrogen, and was asking, sort of which parts, how do you do it, and concluded from looking at all the examples that if you picked one part of the value chain, you might not get others to come do the rest of it. So he decided to vertically integrate. So he now produces with renewable electricity all the hydrogen that he needs to fuel hundreds and hundreds of vehicles, which he's also the telecom operator, so he bought the vehicles from Toyota and from others. He's got a bus company in Warsaw that's making buses, hydrogen fuel cell buses, so he's the producer, the distributor, the fueler, and the end user, and building the industry almost single-handedly in Poland. So in 5 years. So it'll catch up very quickly, especially when people know they can drive to neighboring countries very easily with that technology.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I've had the honor to work with Parkwind in Belgium, and 9 years ago we had the first what I would call pilot scale, but wind to hydrogen production that was used in their retail grocery fleet. And you could see how effective vertical integration was to make the program viable and work. And once you have that test case, it's no surprise to me that Northwestern Europe has become really a center of excellence in hydrogen development and deployment. I do think we've put a lot of money in the game here in the United States, but I did the per capita calculation, and the Japanese still have us beat by a country mile, and I think it's really important to give a nod, particularly given where we are, to the Japanese leadership on hydrogen over the last 20 years, because they've really shown the way. So we're sitting in California, and Terry, I have to come back to you and talk about California's leadership, because there are more than 50 fueling stations here, and you get to own a Mourmouras. So talk to us about, why you're here and how you think California can make the difference.
Well, it does matter that we're the 5th largest economy in the world, so that when we do something at scale, it helps bring down the cost and de-risk things for everyone else. But that was the goal when I was EPA secretary in 2003, 4, 5 for Governor Schwarzenegger, and we created this Hydrogen Highway Coalition to try to get the supply and demand to equal each other for transportation, so it would go forward together and there wouldn't be stranded assets. And silly me, it didn't occur to me that it's not just the supply and demand, you also need the fire marshals and the insurance companies and the neighborhoods where these stations are going to be located. All have got to get on the same page and be comfortable with this. City officials who said, wait a minute, can a hydrogen vehicle go across my bridge safely or park in an underground garage? I mean, all these things I never thought of, but we brought 200 stakeholders together and got them to work on this plan, which, as you say, today we now have actually about 75 stations, 50 public, and about 15,000 vehicles. That's a fraction of the number of Teslas, for example, but as I say, I think the demand for even light duty will increase as more and more people realize that it's a more familiar fueling experience. You go up to what looks like a gas station and a pump, and you put the nozzle on, and 5-10 minutes later you're out the door. But again, also because not everybody has a place where they can plug in. Again, not saying anything against battery technology, and again, look at what Tesla has done, and others are now coming into the market. But I think California now, not just since the Schwarzenegger administration, but the subsequent 2 governors, and currently Governor Newsom, understands that we are running out of time. We have to support all of these different technologies and electrify very, very quickly.
I think there's no one that would contest California's leadership here, and we owe California a debt for that. But I think, Tom, you mentioned hydrogen hubs. Will you just define what a hub is, and let's talk about the scrum that we're in for hydrogen hubs across the United States right now?
Right, absolutely, Elise. So hydrogen hub is a technical term these days, and it means something. It is part of the Department of Energy's Hydrogen Hub program. So there's a federal solicitation, a federal tender, it's FOA, and just very recently, actually, the concept paper was due, which is kind of step 1 in the application process, and then on April 7th, the final papers will be due. So, well, who is applying and who is granting? The Department of Energy is funded through the IIJ, that's, again, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. This about $7.5 to $8, maybe $8.5 billion program that's going to finance between, we think, 6 to 10 hydrogen hubs among clusters of states, or in California's case, one big individual state. And so you asked what's in a hydrogen hub. Well, a hydrogen hub brings together the local state governments and authority holding jurisdictions, energy companies, original equipment manufacturers, fleets, new entrants, existing companies, legacies, educational groups. Let's not forget the community-based organizations, all of these people that might be shareholders or stakeholders. And what we're doing is we're looking to sort of get everybody at the table together, supercharge this with some federal financing. In many of these clusters, it will be matched at the state level and matched again at the private sector level in order to sort of launch really in earnest at a sort of giga scale these hydrogen economies. And some of the clusters are focusing on industrial hydrogen production and use. So that's again the use case for cement and steel making and refining. Some of them are focusing on mobility and movement of people and goods, and then some of them are doing a blend, as you might imagine. So I think as we get to the sort of final deadline in April of this Hydrogen Hub program, we're going to get to learn a lot about who is in each program. Our company's in some of the programs, our competitors are in some of the programs, but really this played out trope of collaboration really is true, and we really are collaborating with everybody.
I can validate the collaboration and have a few hubs that I've been working on. And I want to just mention that you're funding those. That's your tax dollars. And it's really important. And there's a hub coming to a location near you. And this is a real opportunity for you to see hydrogen in your backyard, to go see the innovation that's occurring, and to see a level of collaboration that I think all of us are excited about. And you mentioned competitors, and I would say it's true that there are some of your competitors, but my experience has been entirely that everybody's working together. And I think that's really positive for the future of hydrogen.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, and hydrogen's a small space too. Like, all of us know each other in the hydrogen space, and 1 year one guy might be wearing company A hat, and the next year he shows up with company B hat. But there's all these really good connections that are still, very strong and persisting. Terry over here actually is a big part of the Hydrogen Hub effort called Arches in California. So that's kind of how I got to learn Terry by reputation, and then now we're here together. And this kind of thing happens again and again and again in this space of hydrogen and energy in general. So it's pretty exciting. That's why I do it.
That's perfect. So we're getting down to the end, and I want to make sure we have time for questions. Where do you see the hydrogen sector in the next couple of years? JB, will you start?
My intuition is that is going to go way faster than expected. You were mentioning that the segmentation between heavy mobility and passenger mobility is getting is fading away, so to say, and things can happen. Strategically, most of the car manufacturers, for example, they now say what's happening in China is a strategic, risk that we need to cover for. And so we need to have a hydrogen reply or solutions for pretty much every segment in, for example, the automotive industry, and the industry is the same. So I think it will depend eventually, essentially, about the ability to massively produce decarbonized electricity at the end of the way, and also politically, I think affordability will be key, because right now we see cars are expensive. Used cars are expensive, new cars are expensive. We don't expect that to decrease by 2026, 2027. It's going to be the case for hydrogen. So if we can get to price parity, to convenience parity, then price parity, it's going to be hydrogen is going to be a real competitor in the race for electrification, that's for sure.
Yeah, I think we've been going on about these federal and state level programs. And let's not forget the city programs, right? So the San Pedro Bay Port, San Pedro Bay Ports are supporting zero emissions trucking and such things, and that's really important here. So something that we talk a lot about in hydrogen mobility is diesel price parity, or how close can we get to price parity, both net of credits or after. We have subsidy crediting from schemes like or programs like the LCFS, and then eventually just on its own. And we are already just about at gasoline equivalency, admittedly helped a little bit by where gas prices are too, and we're going to see that more and more and more as more and more hydrogen sources get online. But we need to kind of break out of these clusters in California, Northwest Europe, and China, Japan, Korea to kind of move to new places. And crystal ball, I think that by 2030 you will see a good fraction, material fraction of mobility running, especially in the heavy and medium classes, hydrogen fuel cells in these areas.
I would agree with that, and just to put a little context to it, so because of the Hydrogen Hub effort, just in Southern California, we identified $20 billion worth of projects that are all being submitted. Now, they're obviously all not going to get funding because that's just in Southern California alone, and each hub might get an award of up to $1.25 billion, of course, as Tom mentioned, matched by other funds. But still, it just shows you that there's an enormous appetite for projects that are already being planned and are going to get built one way or the other, with or without that kind of grant funding, although that's obviously an incentive and helpful. The tax breaks that were also in the IRA are extremely important, important signal, and I would agree that sort of 2030 timeline, not only because of all of the infrastructure and the building and the investment and the grant programs that are happening now, but again, because what I mentioned before, where so many of these jurisdictions have 2030 timelines for decarbonizing things. And as Winston Churchill said, you know, Americans always do the right thing, but only after trying everything else first. And I think when it comes to hydrogen, that's kind of where we've been. But now we're on that cusp of getting volume. And one last quick data point on that. So my Mirai holds about 5 kilograms of hydrogen. And there's a 75-passenger hydrogen fuel cell ferry boat that we're bringing into Los Angeles. And that needs about 250 kilograms of hydrogen. And the operator who wants to run it between Long Beach and Los Angeles ports every day said he'll need to fill up at least twice a week, probably 3 times a week. So just that one vessel, you can see the exponentially, yeah. And so then if you have all of these container handlers and other vessels and tugboats and long haul trucks and so forth, that will help bring up scale and bring down cost.
I'm going to add 2 more data points. One is that, and there's good science here, that entities, ventures, companies, and those that are involved in non-dilutive capital efforts from the US government outperform their peers. And I think there's a tendency to look down at these governmental initiatives, and I'm going to encourage you to actually investigate that. And you're going to find that having a lower cost of capital converts to a lower cost per unit, and there's a tremendous reputational advantage to being involved in these programs. So come out and find your favorite hub, particularly if you're an innovation company. And then secondly, one of my favorite reads is KPMG has done a survey of leading OEM CEOs and CFOs for about 10 years. And for 10 years, the collective belief of the leaders in this space has been that hydrogen is the dark horse. And so I think it's worth paying attention to what their perspectives are and to watching this sector. So do we have questions? Please.
So are we going to go in order? I see 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, and I'll walk up and hand folks
I know I got it.
We'll do 1, and then the rest can chat with you during the next.
Okay.
Just 'cause we're running late. I'm sorry.
So I've seen some. First of all, my background is I'm at NASA, and I'm in the eVTOL world, and starting to hear about eVTOLs talk about hydrogen power, and it worries me. So I got on the internet and I started looking up just what's happening on ground transportation, and I've seen a video of a bus and hydrogen-powered bus in Europe just while it's driving have a large explosion, and the way they design the buses to make sure the passengers are safe is they have a huge blast shield on the roof. The hydrogen sits on top of that, so it keeps the passengers safe. I've seen 2 different events, I think one in Northern California and one in Europe, where people are charging their vehicle and there's an explosion during charging. So I don't know if those are things that are like user errors or operator errors, or it's inherently obviously a very dense energy source that we know cars have fuel tanks and those can catch fire. We know that electric batteries can catch fire, but this is a really powerful energy source. So is there any concerns? I mean, obviously you're driving a hydrogen-powered car, so you must be comfortable with the idea of having that much energy next to you. Just your thoughts on safety.
Yeah, look, that's always a concern with a fuel and anything that can go boom. As you said, batteries have overheated and burned, and we've seen Teslas on the side of the road in cinders. But these are very rare, and obviously government agencies and others work very hard to establish safety standards. Businesses obviously go out of business if they can't make the vehicles safe and customers happy. There's a video, the University of Miami, at least 10 years ago, did an experiment with 2 Toyota Corollas that were identical, except one was a gasoline car and one was a hydrogen fuel cell car. And actually, I'm sorry, it was a hydrogen combustion car. They were experimenting with hydrogen as a combustion fuel, so both had an internal combustion engine. And the researchers drilled a 1/4-inch hole in the fuel tank of each and ignited it. And in real time, you can see the video on the screen. And if you go to Energy Independence now, you can watch this. Needless to say, in about 10, 15 minutes, the petroleum car burned to a cinder and everyone in it would have died. The hydrogen vehicle, you couldn't even tell that the fuel was burning because it burns clean. You can't see it. And it's 17 times lighter than air, so of course it wants to dissipate even if the tank breaks. And the tanks are made of carbon fiber, so then they're designed to crack open like an egg if they have to open, so the fuel dissipates. Anyway, the people in the hydrogen car would have been just fine, and it doesn't have the kind of problems that petroleum does. So everything is dangerous potentially and has to be treated safely, but I feel very safe driving my hydrogen car. And as I said, even if I was in an accident, the fuel tank is designed to kind of bounce, and if it doesn't, it's designed to crack open and dissipate the fuel, and hopefully nothing goes boom.
No, just that part of the certification process is just about that. I mean, when you are building a car, you have to test the tanks, for example, and you release a 5-ton stone on the tanks to make sure that it doesn't explode or anything. And the worst case scenario, exactly, that it leaks most of it, most of the time. So, yeah, it's the certification process is very, very stringent, and you make sure that the risk is minimized. It's never zero, but it's really, really minimized.
Sure. Yeah, you walk over.
Moderator's prerogative.
No, that was just to say don't trust fake news. So
Yes.
there are databases. If you really have had that accident, it would have destroyed the hydrogen industry. So knowing for sure in Europe and in the US, you haven't had such accidents. There is a database in the US, it's called HIAD. So you can go to that database and you have the equivalent one in Europe. So there was an accident in Europe on the station. There was one in Korea. So these are the 2 accidents that existed in the world so far. And the one in Europe hasn't injured. So there was nobody refueling at the station. So yeah, there was no injury at the station, around the station.
She stole my thunder. I was going to say the same thing, in that I've worked with NASA for 20 years and they chose hydrogen for a reason.
Well, thanks to our moderator and a great panel.
Thank you, Elise.